Hi, everybody. We're here live ahead of qualifying for the Monaco Grand Prix. Rob, last week in this spot, you had a lot of tough decisions to make. You had to move your team around, and it was a very anxious moment for you. I think now I'm starting this week with Red Bull and Max Verstappen, so I'm in the hot seat.
Yeah, it's crazy how things have taken a turn with McLaren and Ferrari really coming along in the last couple of weeks. So I think I certainly didn't make the moves last week anticipating what would shake out in Monaco, but feeling a lot more at ease this time around with decisions mostly made up an hour out from the deadline.
And the latest rider sims have just dropped on F1FantasyTools.com, and it's making my decision even harder because they're throwing some Aston Martins and Mercedes drivers into the mix. So going to be a very interesting hour as my mental process unfolds in front of all of you. Let's dive into some of that free practice data, Rob, because the common theme across all the sessions this weekend is that Charles Leclerc is dialed into his home race. You can see our giveaway question below for some great fifth gear Garm swag is, does Charles beat his best ever Monaco finish, which is P4? So if you haven't answered that already, head on over to our FanAmp base and let us know if you think Charles is going to have a new personal best at his home race.
Definitely.
Let me ask you then, Rob, do you think Charles will beat that P4?
Yeah, I definitely do. I think he's looked excellent through all three practice sessions. He's looked extremely rapid, and he's historically got a really good qualifying kind of history at this track at his home Grand Prix. So I definitely think he can kind of replicate that. I don't know yet if pole position is likely, just because of how strong Max has been this season, and knowing Max, he probably will turn out something otherworldly as he did last time around in Monaco. But I still think Charles is on for, if not pole, certainly P2, just from what we've seen. What about you?
I agree. I think this concept that Charles is cursed at his home race is starting to wear off. Some of these recent examples with Charles have been things that are somebody's fault, something that you can fix, something that you can improve on, not acts of God. You know, last time out, it was an impeding penalty on Lando Norris. These are things he can learn from and fix. He's coming into qualifying clean, so as long as there's no impeding issues there, I think all signs are pointing to a P1 start for Charles, and as long as things go well, a P1 finish. So I really like him there. But you talked about Max. Max can set the record for the most consecutive poles with 9 and break that tie with Senna. And Max has led at least one lap in 14 straight races. So the form there for Max has been incredible.
Yeah, definitely. Before we jump into looking at the practice times on screen, I was going to see if there's anything in the chat worth covering off.
Some hellos to our friends. Racing is epic.
Questions.
Mike, Nico, good morning to all of you. Let's see. Roland's coming to us from Namibia. Good morning, Roland.
Smoke from India. Love that. Global coverage. So yeah, I think let's just quickly cover off. I think while we're getting the sims up, not the sims, the practice times up on screen. I think in terms of a couple of team questions, Clyde's asking, would you unleash triple Ferrari in Monaco or go for a more balanced setup, considering a Sargent Sainz swap for Piastri and Albon? What's your take on that?
So I think the balance here is moving away from triple Ferrari and trying to get a little of that McLaren action. I think, Rob, that's something that you have been toying with all week. Do you go with Sainz or Piastri in that spot? If you go with Piastri, like the question asks, you then afford Albon, who's looked pretty good in the early practice sessions. I think for you and I, we're a little bit scorned after the DNF at Imola last week. I think it really depends. The last sims I've seen indicate that Sainz has an advantage over Piastri, but can Albon get us a couple of points? Can he keep it out of the wall compared to Logan Sargent? I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's kind of hard. Williams look pretty terrible across the board, and I'm in a similar situation like a Piastri Sainz. I wouldn't call it a dilemma because I'm fairly set on Piastri, just because I'm not sure for me personally if I've got the minerals to go triple Ferrari and Logan Sargent all in one weekend. But I do think if you feel optimistic on Ferrari's chances, then you should certainly take a punt.
Agreed. Some more hellos. Marius is from South Africa, and Benji is a countryman of yours, Rob, coming from Adelaide.
There we go. Love an Australian feature. Cool. Practice times are up. Do you want to quickly dissect those?
Sure. Yeah. So you can see really, there was some pretty high track evolution through the first practice. So you could see again Mercedes doing the thing that they do on Friday, dominating the timesheets, and then falling off as things go into Saturday. So I'm not as convinced that my favorite team will show up this weekend, but they
Mm.
are consistently in the top 5 throughout the different sessions. It wasn't until if you move up to practice 2, this is where Leclerc beat the qualifying time from last year. So it was our first sense that Charles was really dialed in to his home circuit. And you can see again, Max, just hanging around the bottom of the top 5, Perez the bottom of the top 10. These were the first indications that perhaps Red Bull were off the pace. And
Mm.
so all eyes were starting to move to a Ferrari McLaren build. The rider sims on Friday night were very Ferrari McLaren heavy. And if we move up to practice 3 from this morning, not a whole lot of activity besides, Max dialing things in a little bit more heading up to P2. We're going to talk about why we think that was the case, the growth from Friday to Saturday in just a minute. And then Charles, again, seemed to be perfect just about everywhere.
Yeah,
So
he was immaculate, wasn't he?
he really was. Just no errors. It seemed like things were going really well for him. And if you pan over to one of those first bits of data that look at the sectors. Ooh, this is a chat about why Max looked so off on
Sorry.
Friday. The reason why, you can see there was some suggestion that Red Bull was running a lower engine mode, and that's why Max was a bit lower. And here's the proof from Formula Data Analysis. Red Bull had the slowest of the top speeds on Friday in free practice too. So they suspect it's worth about 0.3 versus Ferrari when they get that engine mode back up. But Max was 0.5 down from Leclerc. So there's still 0.2 he needed to get from that. And we saw in free practice 3 this morning, he still fell just a little bit short of it. So it'll be interesting to see if Max can get things right to get pole tomorrow.
Today, you mean?
Pole today for tomorrow.
Yeah. I do think, and we were talking about this a lot last week as well around kind of Max's performance through practice. And I do think, he's got the pedigree, the experience. We know how good of a driver he is. I definitely think he will be challenging for pole, but I just can't look past Charles right now. And as a fantasy asset to own, he's the standout best option. We've probably got a lot of data to dissect, and I know Terry's coming on in the show shortly as well. But I do want to quickly also swing across to the latest F1 fantasy tool sims, if we can just go there for a minute, because to kind of segue off your point around Max and kind of his performance on track, what does that mean for kind of the latest simulation results? And if we go down here, the point spread is in the post FP3, like daylight between Charles and Max.
That means there's a pretty heavy assumption that Charles will get driver of the day. I think even if he finishes P2 and P3, because it's his home race, I think Sainz is a little bit back, Lando's a little bit back. If it's between Charles and Max, he'll definitely get it. But Lando is on 3 straight driver of the days. If he gets 4th, that's an all-time record.
Well, yeah, that would be something. It's hard with Lando at, what is he, 25.4, when you've got the likes of Charles and even Carlos Sainz and Oscar Piastri having his measure through practice. So I feel as though everyone that jumped on Lando in Imola and were fortunate enough to get that $1 million increase may well be moving off him this week, given how good Ferrari has been looking.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is definitely the week for Ferrari. It's a matter now of, do you do 1, 2, or all 3? So I think we'll see definitely an even spread as we go through some of the lineup reviews in just a minute.
A couple of questions I want to cover off that I've seen come through in the chat is in relation to Mercedes, and they're your team. You love the Silver Arrows, like a few other F1 things, but I do want to get your take on people who are entertaining a Mercedes constructor build, or even maybe a Lewis Hamilton.
I think a lot of these questions are coming from the latest rider sims, because when I set the team calculator to my budget, which is 111.1 million, I'm getting a lot of Russell and Hamilton at the top of the lineups there. I think that's because they suspect a top 5 finish for Mercedes. They've looked pretty good through the first practice sessions, and it allows you to afford slightly better drivers on the bottom of your lineup. For me, I think the best chance of points and cost cap build is going to be that Sainz Piastri decision as the number 2 driver after Charles, instead of a Lewis and George. Although last year, wouldn't we have been salivating if we had the opportunity to run Charles and Lewis on our teams in a given week?
Even next year as well. having that double Ferrari 1-2 punch. But yeah, fascinating. I just thought I'd bring up your budget here. I think though it doesn't quite account for your current team, given you're running Red Bull and Max. But for anyone kind of in that 109 to 111 price bracket or budget bracket, I think there's a lot of different combinations, but I think that's great for the game. There's so many options at the moment. I know we probably have to get through some teams soon as well. Do we want to? I'd be eager to just cover off a few more questions in the chat, because
Sure.
there is quite a number of viewers today.
It's a busy week.
So I do want to make sure we're not neglecting anyone with burning questions that they need answered.
Some quick hello. Jake's coming from Newfoundland. Hi, Jake. I'm a Great Big Sea fan. I went to Newfoundland a few years ago, and it was really beautiful.
I've not yet been there.
The Dirty Side guys are here. Hey, Dirty Side.
Hi, Rob. Hi, Brian. How are you both?
All right. Built Different wants to know, if we want to have as many top 10 drivers in this race as possible, doesn't a Leclerc, Alonso, Tsunoda, Hulk, Gasly, Ferrari, McLaren make sense? So basically, two sure thing top 10 drivers in Leclerc and Alonso, and then a few dice rolls with Tsunoda, Hulkenberg, and Gasly, with the hope that you can get one of them in there. It could. I think the other thought there is that if you have two high-end drivers, the final fix will make you flexible to between Leclerc, Alonso, and Tsunoda. You could move to any of these Esteban Ocon surprises like we had last year, where a midfield driver qualifies in the top 5 and is a shoe-in for some big points. I think that makes a lot of sense. This was a team that I think up until just recently, the Sims were very confident in. And I think you can still see Alonso on some of these builds. So not a bad team at all.
Yeah, I think on that, I was actually talking to a few people about this on a Twitter space yesterday, whether or not the Aston Martin constructor makes sense. And at a track like Monaco, where qualifying is of the highest importance and Stroll doesn't really have a great record in that department, I think if you do want Aston Martin coverage, then Fernando Alonso, if you want to go for any of the Aston Martin asset pool, is the standout choice. And I do think he's got that experience. He was on provisional pole last year. So I really like Alonso. I really like Hamilton as two low-owned, high upside drivers heading into the weekend.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I noticed this point from Racing is Epic in the chat, where they say Leclerc, Red Bull, Ferrari team is where they want to stick, and the Sims agree. One counterpoint is I'm juggling a very similar decision, is where McLaren are in Tier B. I think with one, if not two at the longest, more good races from them, McLaren's going to be into Tier A for the price changes. So I'm trying to capture a little bit of budget, because I think I'm falling behind after my conservative build for Imola last week. So that's why I'm leaning a bit toward McLaren, but I can see why folks would run Red Bull too. You have the pit stop points, and Max just by themselves can carry your team pretty far.
Yeah, and I think on that, Red Bull is probably for me a much easier decision for as opposed to Max Verstappen. And I know the Dirty Side guys have asked kind of a similar question as well. And correct me or maybe not correct me, but like let me know if you have a different opinion on this, Adam. But I think Max, for me, even though he doesn't look great in Monaco so far, I think still has a lot of viability as a 2x driver in our teams most weeks. And I think Red Bull will kind of rediscover some of that performance in Spain and in Canada coming up. So I think it's much easier to justify owning Max from next week onwards. But Red Bull, if Perez struggles continue and McLaren and Ferrari performance improves, I think that's a much easier decision to balance.
That's exactly where my head's at. How can I get coverage of McLaren and Ferrari this week without bending over backwards so much that I can't get some Max coverage heading into Canada? Because I think Red Bull's going to just pick it right back up in 2 weeks.
Cool.
Vince Smoke wants to know, are we still taking lineup submissions? Yes. If you head over to the FanAmp app, the Fantasy Formula base, take a screenshot of your team and shoot it over there, and our producer will put it in the slide deck that Rob's about to share.
Yeah. F1 Fantasy Tools. Hello. Love their
good morning.
Yeah, good morning. Good afternoon, wherever you guys are. I'm not even sure if I know the answer to that, but they've obviously made a great point around Charles and the driver of the day upside. So that's massive. I think it will increase his predictor score, as they've pointed out. And that probably also means a big budget bump for if he does capitalize on that too.
Absolutely. Rob, we've got about 5 minutes until Terry
Mm,
jumps in. Do you want to head over to some lineup builds? See if we
excellent,
can
excellent idea. Let me see
cover
if I
some of
can
that.
zoom this in for people on screen. We got quite a few, so maybe we try and race through as many as we can, and then see what the great man Terry has to say.
So this is the question about, do we stick with Red Bull and Ferrari or move to McLaren and Ferrari and then spread some of that love out amongst some of our other teams?
I know you've got this on your other screen, Adam. So I'm going to do my best to zoom in where I can.
No,
But
that's fine. So the middle build is Leclerc with McLaren Ferrari. The last build is Verstappen McLaren Ferrari. I think the rest of the drivers, it's just different flavors of the same
mm, mm,
midfield and back markers.
mhm,
I'd lean toward the middle team,
mm,
team two. So you get the price boost and the high points upside of Leclerc, McLaren, Ferrari. Got some good dice throws in the middle with double Haas and Pierre Gasly, who was one of the bright spots of this race last season.
mhm.
And then I think you can easily pivot back to a Max and or Red Bull build for Canada without
Can
having to use your wild card, which it looks like
correct.
the last option requires.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that's very prudent, and I think it also has slightly more budget upside with Charles over Max too. So I like that middle team.
Good. All right. So we've got Red Bull, Ferrari, Leclerc, Stroll. Moving to a very popular build from the latest rider sims is Leclerc, Hamilton. And then the last one is a -10 with Leclerc, Piastri. Now this, and then you also have Sargent at the end instead of
Mm,
Bottas. One of
mm,
the questions, if any of you have heard an update on Valtteri, he had a bit of an incident in FP3. They had to keep his car sidelined through the rest of the session. So short window for Sauber to repair it. Hopefully they can get him back on track. Otherwise, that would be a -5 if he can't post a qualifying time.
definitely.
For me, Rob, oh man, as much as I love Lewis, I would almost take the -10 for the last team. I just can't quite trust Mercedes yet. I want to see them demonstrate that they can put a few races together before I would go disinvested.
I personally think it's quite tight on these two. The one thing I will say for the -10 is it very much kind of hinges on Lewis Hamilton really having a stinker in qualifying to make the -10 worth it, because the point spread is just not that much at all this weekend. So if there was a case to take a -10, I think the decision has to be for one of the top teams or the top drivers. There's just very little argument I can make for any midfield or back marker driver, but I'm probably leaning towards the middle team, if I'm being honest, just because there's no Sargent. And if Lewis can get a couple of good laps in qualifying, I think he's on for a decent shot. But Piastri does have some pretty good sims. His points projection went up between FP2 and FP3. So if you're confident in McLaren, go for it. But for a -10 and no Logan, for no -10 and no Logan, I'm slightly leaning towards the middle team.
Sounds good to me. They're both very close.
They're both close, yeah. Well, this is a lot of teams.
All right.
Faint. Oops, sorry. Goodness me, there's trying to see if there was more wording on the page.
It's okay. It's a lot of Charles Yuki, Red Bull, Ferrari on the top, and then Charles Yuki, Lance or Gasly, McLaren, Ferrari on the bottom. I think this is going to depend on your cost cap situation. And do you want to potentially try to pull up a few more points on the top or a few more budget increases on the bottom? I think McLaren have a higher points upside than Red Bull. Lance, if he can string together a good lap, a higher points upside. I mean, a higher cost cap upside than maybe an Esteban Ocon. But man, after last year, how could you argue with Esteban Ocon?
Yeah, no, exactly. But I think that you can make that for any driver in the midfield or at the bottom of the top teams. Like, you just need one good Q3 lap and boom, you're in the top 3, top 4. So I think that's where like the Alpines, even like Hulkenberg or Tsunoda, strike me as drivers that have just looked very good so far this season. And, you know, they do have the capabilities to put that car in the top 4 on the second row. So all eyes on qualifying, to be honest. I like, in terms of actually giving an answer to the question, I think I like I think I like the bottom left team. I know Red Bull does the kind of a nice fallback, but I do like the idea of rolling a transfer, running McLaren, and I prefer Gasly over Stroll as a qualifier. So that's probably my decision.
Ooh, I didn't see the rolling a transfer until there. I think that's going to be really helpful for you come Canada. And that's what's making my life just slightly easier this week is my conservative build in Imola allowed me to roll a transfer into this week. So I might take a -10 to do triple Ferrari, but it could have been a lot worse.
Definitely. Okay, let's race through one or two more, and then we can.
All right. And so a lot of questions in the chat about this topic of Red Bull and Ferrari for the points, Ferrari and McLaren for the cost cap build.
Trying to zoom in again. This is the challenge of getting so many submissions, is that
it's a good problem to have. We're very interested.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
So I think again, it depends a little bit if you want to chase cost cap. I'm leaning toward chasing cost cap more this week because I fell behind the rest of the pack. I don't know if some of you are operating with that same urgency. So my eyes lean a bit more toward the proposed team on both sides. Because on the left, you still have coverage of Max. You can easily get out of that for Canada. You still have some good points upside and cost cap build upside with Yuki, double Haas, McLaren. On the right, lots of cost cap build upside with that lineup. And then it might take an extra transfer or 2 weeks to get you back into Red Bull coverage, but not the end of the world.
Yeah, true. The one thing I'll say about someone like Stroll for this weekend is that I do find typically he's a great asset to own if he doesn't DNF, but I think he's, as I mentioned before, not the best qualifier going around. And I get the impression that if he goes out in Q1 or is like kind of P14, P15, are there going to be as many overtakes that he can make in that kind of top 5, top 6 car that I just don't really see happening at Monaco? So kind of tread with caution. I think most weeks he's a great budget building driver to own, but Monaco is one of the very few tracks on the calendar I'd probably just approach with a bit more caution than usual for someone like him.
Right. For anybody who missed our show earlier this week, Stroll leads all drivers in overtakes this year, but Monaco's been dead last each of the last 2 years in overtakes. So I think one of the only ways midfield drivers will improve their position is through tire strategy and having a longer stint, potentially getting positions gained. But I'm very pessimistic about overtakes.
Okay. That's a great point. Okay, let's do one more and then let's get Terry in. I think we're getting close to our time here.
Sure.
Okay.
All right, we got Max on one side, Charles Carlos on the other side. I'm doing it. I'm doing triple Ferrari this week if I have those options.
I would too. I mean, I have that option exactly. And my team would be almost identical except for Hulkenberg instead of Sargent, and then probably either Piastri or Sainz. So it's a tough one. But of these two teams, I definitely like the one on the right.
Vegard in the chat says the F2 races now had 4 DNFs.
Oh, goodness.
Carnage already. So
no negatives?
Yes, I know. I've had a few people ask me about no negative. This race doesn't have a ton of DNFs year to year. It is fixing to be pretty dry tomorrow. So I still think leaving it for a sprint later in the season, you have more opportunities for negatives. So I'd hold on to it if you still have it.
All right. I want to quickly, before we get Terry in, just quickly smash out a couple of questions in the chat, because if we don't address those questions, then we might be going 20 minutes.
It might age a bit, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I've lost my mark, but...
Oh, yeah, I'm shooting from the hip a bit now.
Okay.
Leapsfrog, roll a transfer and keep Sargent or swap to Gasly.
That's tight.
What you could do is roll the transfer, keep Sargent, and if Gasly looks good enough that he's not just in the low teens, you could final fix Gasly in for Sargent like you would have last year. Stroll was in a similar situation. He qualified way low, Gasly way high. If he made that switch, it was like a 20-point swing. And keep your transfer.
Good point. I think 3 next week is going to be awfully important too. So I don't think, in terms of Christopher's question around taking hits, is it Christopher, or built different? I just wouldn't take hits this weekend unless like it's absolutely obvious in the F1 Fantasy Tool sims that you should. So maybe stick clear of that just because of how few points are on the table, and then drop Red Bull for McLaren and Ferrari. I personally will, but I think there's probably a case just because of the budget and the points. But again, if you're confident the pit stops are a nice fallback, go for that. Jacob, again, I wouldn't take a -10. And yeah, I think that might be it. Any other quick questions before we bring in Terry?
No, let's do it. I have a lot of questions for Terry.
Okay, great. Well, hello, Terry.
Hello. How are you?
Nervous this week, Terry. How about you?
Very nervous.
It's going to be a strange week. I want to go straight to Red Bull. Yesterday, we were chatting offline. You said, don't worry. Red Bull have tuned down their engines. Things are going to be much better come Saturday. It's Saturday, and I'm not relieved yet. Does Red Bull have something left in the tank? Are you seeing anything that should give us hope for that Red Bull constructor?
There's always hope. I mean, if you look at Max's time in FP3, he wasn't that far off Charles's time, and he was on older soft tyres when he set it. So I don't think they're a million miles away. They're losing in Sector 2, which is where we heard that very cryptic Max radio message, which I think is more designed around a gamble that he's going to have to take in qualifying, if I'm honest. So I think they've got what they can out of the setup. They did some work overnight. Yesterday, they turned it down. Max took a new battery before this weekend, which explains why the engine mode was turned down as well, because I imagine they were phasing that in and making sure that was okay. So there's a lot of testing going on with that during FP1 especially. So that makes a bit of sense to why we saw this low power mode, which a lot of people found strange for it to be really turned down. It was a brand new battery, so I assume they wanted some installation laps and checking on it first, which makes perfect sense. But I think it's Max, isn't it? I think he's going to be there or thereabouts, and that's probably the big dilemma, isn't it? When we talk about Red Bull, I think we got to separate the two. I'm not sure Checo's going to be anywhere near the front in terms of qualifying, but I firmly believe that Max is. So from a fantasy point of view, do you make that change of Max and Red Bull, knowing that Checo potentially is going to be down the pecking order, or do you actually stick with Red Bull? So,
it's a great question. Is Max and pit stops enough to carry the Red Bull constructor?
Yeah, exactly. Because I think that Charles, like we said, he's been on it all weekend. And unless there's an issue with qualifying in terms of a red flag, traffic, anything along those lines, I think that it's between Max and Charles from what I'm seeing in terms of pole position. Just give you an update from the stewards. Lando Norris has got a reprimand and Max has got a warning as well. So there's nothing, no penalties or anything impeding for both those two. The stewards are cleared in both, which we expected that from practice, but just to give everyone that ease that it's been looked at and dealt with.
Speaking
on,
of updates, Terry, have we heard about Bottas?
Great question.
He's back to the pits. We've not heard anything. I think they'll be okay. It didn't look like it was. It's a front suspension change, so I think they'll be okay. They probably would like to have done it earlier and quicker, obviously, getting it back. But I'm not hearing anything that says they're overly worried about it. So I think they'll be fine for qualifying.
Okay, good, because he's stuck on my team. I think no matter what I do, so I need them to figure it out in the next 30 minutes.
Absolutely. I've been keeping an eye on that. He's in mine as well. So I've been having a quick look at Stake's tweets.
A couple questions in the chat, one of which is also addressed to you specifically, Terry, around Fernando Alonso. And, you know, he's a bit of a wily old fox, to quote Martin Brundle, as a driver around a track like Monaco. Do you think he's in with a decent shout at qualifying well today? Or is it kind of hard to buy into that, given how well performing Ferrari and McLaren have been?
I think he's always worth it in Monaco, isn't he? He's been showing that. There's been moments in FP1 and FP2, not so much in FP3, where he just puts the lap almost out of nowhere near the top. And I think with Fernando, I think he will bank an early good lap, which may just be enough for him if something happens towards the end of qualifying. So it's so tough with him, because I don't think the Aston Martin's there on performance. It looks more settled for him. But I certainly think Fernando can put a one lap, stick it into a good position, and then obviously for the race itself, he'll make it extremely difficult to get past him. That's for sure. We saw a couple of years ago when he just held everybody up, didn't he? So he's not one you're going to get past easy in Monaco if he's in front of you, that's for sure.
I don't even know where I'm trying to run through all of the decisions that I have to make in the next 15 minutes.
Well, Adam, why don't you think maybe this time around you can use the show as just something you can think about in the background, and Terry and I can dissect a few more.
That sounds good. Keep firing away while I just spin my wheels on what my lineup will look like.
The dirty side boys called you out, Terry, as Mansell's best mate. So after your trip to is it Silverstone this week? During the week?
Silverstone and the Williams factory. Yeah, I've been stalking Nigel Mansell, or Nigel's been stalking me. I'm not quite sure which way around it was, to be honest. But yeah, we've been on some tour of motorsport, events this week, Nigel and I. So we've not got to the point where we're swapping WhatsApp messages yet, but I'm sure we will be soon.
Who knows? Who knows? Another question I had was in relation to the Mercedes team in general. Now, Lewis looked great through the first couple practice sessions, maybe not quite as high up the timing charts as he was in FP3, but do you think, much like Fernando, he's in with a good shot this weekend? It seems to be a story lately of Mercedes looking great in practice and then tweaking their setup and somehow falling back in qualifying and in the race.
The really interesting thing is Lewis is on the old setup, which is really bizarre because Lewis is running the old front wing on the car. George has got the new one. George has had steering problems. He had a whole front suspension change overnight. So that was what was clearly bothering him, and we saw that installation lap in FP3 where he just went out, did a lap, and came back in. So he's obviously got some gremlins they've been trying to iron out. But Lewis looks comfortable. He looks actually tuned in. That setup, whatever he's got in terms of the older setup, seems to be working for him. And he's another driver who, around Monaco, a bit like Fernando, if he can get that good lap in and get it in a position where it's just whether or not he's going to get a good enough lap. I don't think Mercedes have got the beat in terms of Max, Ferrari and the McLarens, but that traffic, the new rules we got on the pit lanes coming into effect as well, with cars going into the fast lane. We've seen what's just happened in the support races. It could just be carnage towards the end if we get a red flag or if we get a crash somewhere.
Sure, interesting.
Harry, you had mentioned a moment ago, we were talking about Alonso and his qualifying form, but there was a feature from Sam Collins on this new front wing for Aston Martin. They have the opening at the front nose structure has a little vertical bit, and then on the edges of the top wing elements, there's a little dip to direct some airflow in between the tire and the brake duct better. Do you think we could see any gains from that at this circuit, or are they just trying to get as much data as they can so that when we get back to a more traditional situation for Canada in 2 weeks, then we could see some performance gains?
I think we will see some. Anything on the brake ducts around Monaco is going to help. A lot of teams actually made the updates on the update list was around opening up those brake ducts to actually cool them down, because they haven't got the long straights which they normally use to cool them down. So they tend to open up a lot more to get a lot more air into and stop them, essentially catching fire in the slow corners. So anything which helps around that is going to be good for them. And you can afford to dial down that speed because you don't need it here as well. So that problem that Aston Martin struggle with in terms of that top line speed doesn't actually affect them as much around Monaco, which, probably like we've seen with Mercedes as well. They're actually cars which all the stuff where they normally have problems with is not so much for a factory in Monaco and actually helping them to gain a bit of performance and creep closer to the top teams.
It'd be interesting to see. So many questions about Alonso and lineups that feature Stroll for the cost cap the upside for him this week. I'll be interested to see if that little wing can make a difference.
Yeah, and I think I agree with you on Stroll. I think with the lack of overtaking opportunities, I think Stroll's probably a bigger risk for me than maybe taking a punt on Fernando, because I think there's not going to be the overtaking here. We're not expecting a massive weather forecast which is going to cause problems during the race itself. So it should go back to a normal one-stop strategy. Less of a safety car. We've got 70% chance of a safety car around Monaco. So unless that plays a factor in it, we should just expect a standard one stop. It's a 19-second pit stop here. So there isn't going to be many people trying an extra pit stop unless a safety car brings it out.
That was the most fascinating thing, looking at kind of the history of this track the last couple seasons, where I feel like up until 2022 there was, and us F1 fantasy creators are probably a product of this as well, of maybe overhyping the risk of a DNF or several at a track like Monaco. There was only one last year, which I think it was Stroll, and looking back the year prior, I think it was the Haas drivers where Schumacher and Magnussen crashed out, and maybe one other. It's a tricky track, and I think someone mentioned in the chat there's quite a number of them that were in F2 earlier, but do you think we're going to see multiple safety cars this weekend, or is it?
No, I think the runoff areas we've got in the main areas should be quite good, coming out of the chicane at the top of sort of turn 2 in that area there where we saw Lewis going off, and we saw, I think it was Kevin Magnussen doing that fancy little pirouette in that area as well. So it's only a collision that will cause a multiple DNF in Monaco. The engine reliabilities, we all know they're pretty bulletproof around here nowadays with this engine freeze we've had for a number of years now. So we're talking about now if someone gets caught up in something potentially, which is a risky strategy to play because they're so fast now with yellow flags, virtual safety cars. Unless you're following someone very closely, then you're probably not going to get caught up in it. And I can't remember the last one around Monaco. He's going to say with complete, curse on it now, where we had a multiple sort of DNFs on it.
True. Well,
Rob and I are extra nervous because only one driver DNF'd last week at Imola, and he was on our team. So we're hoping to just whatever good vibes we can put into our team this week, we'll take them.
I just know that whatever driver I do pick will ultimately DNF. That's just the nature of the beast in fantasy. Yeah. So I've made my bed with that.
It's good. You had a stretch of, what was it, 7 races in a row last year, Rob? The second
half? It was tragic. I think it was even more than that. It's probably like 9 or like maybe 11 out of the last 12 races I had a DNF in my team. So it doesn't really help the fantasy rank when you get stuck with something like that.
No. Terry, are you seeing anything either from the free practice data or from the upgrades you've reported on FanAmp.com about a driver that could be this year's Esteban Ocon, who has no business qualifying in the top 5, but does and could be a surprise source of fantasy points?
Only Lewis.
How the mighty have fallen.
Nothing springs out. Yeah. But no, I mean, for me, there's nothing which it's going to be timing. It's going to be timing. It's going to be traffic. We've seen, Lando go to stewards. We've seen Max go to stewards. It's traffic around Monaco is going to be the biggest factor here. And it's going to be who gets that early lap and who banks that time early to make sure they can go through to Q3 and then not sort of bank on that last lap and that side of things. So, it's one of those where I just think there's not a midfield team who's going to make that stretch up unless they get lucky in qualifying and they hold on to it. I think any of the teams, if they get a good qualifying, will be fine because you can't overtake here. I think just for Christian Horner just saying how it's becoming virtually impossible to have 2 cars side by side around Monaco. So there's 1 or 2 overtaking ones, but yeah, it's going to be tough. But I've actually on my fantasy team, I've actually swapped Red Bull out, which might give you an inkling to where I'm thinking.
This was where we learned a lot last week. When we heard from you and Laura Winter that you kept Red Bull in, I knew they were hiding something. This week, if you've taken them out, that means something.
It's telling. Yeah.
I have. I've kept Max and I've put Ferrari and McLaren in as my 2. So that's my move.
Ooh, keep going. What is your 2X and then number 2 driver look like with all that extra budget?
I've got Max as my 2X driver, then I've got Hülkenberg, Magnussen, Yuki, and Bottas.
Nice.
Gotcha. So you're hedging there. You've got McLaren and Ferrari as your constructors, but keeping Max at the top because
nice.
The ceiling is high and the floor is high too.
Yeah, so that's what I'm going for. I'm going for Max rather than Red Bull performing, and then hopefully picking up the right side of what they deliver as well. So that's where I've hedged my bets.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I think that probably answers a few different questions on McLaren. That Ferrari McLaren seem to be the most popular constructor combination for most people this weekend. So I've locked in my team, and I'll bring it up on screen a bit later. But much like you, Terry, I've stuck with the Ferrari McLaren route for another week. But I haven't yet landed on Red Bull coverage for the second week in a row, which is mind-boggling to me, given I think I had Red Bull for pretty much all of the last 2 seasons up until Imola.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Rob, any last questions for Terry before we jump back into the chat?
I don't think so. Love the insights from Terry. It always helps inform my decisions because it made my decision even harder last week. But I went into this stream knowing, Terry, no matter what you say, I have to just decide.
Yes. And it was in this space last week that if you listened to Terry and you kept that Max and Red Bull build, you still hung on compared to some of the teams like Rob that went with the more audacious builds and scored a ton of points. Terry talked me into keeping the team the way it was, and I survived. So
yeah, it worked out.
Yeah, so I'm going for my Max Ferrari McLaren this week. We'll see if that one pays dividends when we come out of the race tomorrow.
Sounds good, Terry. Best of luck to you this week, and thanks again as always for coming on.
No worries. Thank you very much.
All right. Let's jump back into the chat. We've got Joao in the chat that says 3 transfers with Verstappen, Red Bull, Ferrari. Should I move to Leclerc, Piastri, McLaren, and then just other low tier? I think that's what I'm heading toward, either Piastri or Sainz, sort of a coin toss for me at this point, and then other low tier. That'd be the goal. And then keep the final fix open in case somebody outperforms. You can then move from the Leclerc and Piastri to whoever's in that price range.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm trying to find the mark again in the chat. There was a few different additions, but
I'm around the 925 timestamp. I hope that's where
yes.
most folks are.
Yeah. 925. Found it. I got it. I think question around final fix. It's hard to say absolutely before this, before we see qualifying to give you an obvious answer, but the poll makes it clear at the moment that people aren't going in with an absolute decision yet. So wait until we see qualifying. If there's a surprise, then I might well pull trigger on it.
Yeah, some quick notes on final fix. Rob covered this off really nicely in a post earlier this week, is that you can't final fix a constructor. It's got to be a driver you can afford. It doesn't cost a transfer. If you use your transfers, you're not going to take a -10 by using the final fix. And at the end of the race week, the move that you made will be undone for the sake of budget changes.
Yep, spot on.
Jeremy wants to know Magnussen or Ricciardo.
It's a tough one. I think Ricciardo, to be honest, he's probably my pick if I have to give a straightaway answer.
I don't say this every week, but I go with Ricciardo too. I think the delta between their qualifying pace and race pace is pretty high. And I think he could be one of these drivers that qualifies really low, goes long on a stint and gains a bunch of time. And then he just cuts the others.
Yeah,
could be some positions.
He had his first Q3 last week as well, so I think that's a good sign. Don John's asking Ferrari McLaren or Ferrari Mercedes. I think we're both set on McLaren as the standout option there. And then NK kind of segueing into more McLaren question is, do you think Lewis is a punt over the McLaren drivers? I'm inclined to say no, but I think if you're looking for a differential, then Lewis is the best going around.
Yep, differential is the word that came to mind for me. F1 Fantasy Tools has your back that Lewis should put up a decent week, but if you're wrong or if Lewis has a stinker in qualifying, then you might be a bit behind the rest of the pack. Whereas if the McLaren drivers have a stinker, a lot of us are going down with you.
Yeah. Before, I know we're 20 minutes out from the deadline. I don't want you to miss your team submission. I've already posted mine on Twitter, so if anyone wants to find out my last decisions, you can go over there. And if you need more time, Adam, I can cover off a few questions in the chat.
I just hit the submit button. I just took a deep breath and went for it. So I'm going to hit the post button and we can.
Good. I'll let you pull that together if it's not already ready to go and cover off a couple of quick questions if you want.
Sure, go ahead.
Nicholas asking if RB, I assume that's VCarb, as a money building constructor. I'm not so sure they are the pick just yet. I think Daniel and Yuki are good shots to make Q3, but I don't think they're going to be high enough up the leaderboard given how just good value for money McLaren and Ferrari are this weekend. On Bottas, Maslim's just asking the update there. We don't have one. Terry shared us. There's no news on that, but I think if that's anything to go by, he should hopefully be in the box seat for a qualifying appearance. Sainz or Piastri? I went with Piastri, but I think it's really close. I think the simulations have them dead even and value increases dead even as well. So I went for Piastri only because I don't know if I can stomach triple Ferrari and Logan Sargent all in one weekend. But if you do like Sainz over Piastri, there's absolutely nothing wrong with going that.
I'll tell you, I've brought plenty of antacid to the couch for qualifying today, and I went triple Ferrari. So just to show you how split everyone is, the center split and Rob and I are split.
Yeah, love that. Well, so many questions. I feel like I'm falling behind and we still have teams to go through as well.
All right. I'm back in the mix. We can either show our teams, we can dive into more questions, we can dive into more teams.
Why don't I quickly, if you've posted it on Twitter, we'll just bring both of our teams up quickly and then we can jump into the last questions on FanAmp.
Let's do it.
Let me just find you here.
I don't know if you covered off Reed's question. Do you think it's a bad week to use wildcard? I wouldn't use wildcard just because we're not certain what the best running order is going to be, and you close yourself off from final fix. I would go with your heart, pick that team that works, and then keep the final fix open to you in case we have some surprises. So here I am. I'm taking a -10. I carried a transfer over so I could make those 4 moves. I'm running double Sauber with Logan Sargent. And so it's really, can I get those points off a triple Ferrari and McLaren? Can I get the cost cap builds that I'm hoping for so that on a low point scoring week, I can get myself a little bit into better teams as the season goes on?
Yeah, well, almost back to identical again, Adam, given I've got pretty much the same team with the exception of Sainz and Piastri, which, as you say, goes to show how close it is on the decision there. So I think a -10 is also, I think we talked about this earlier, not a bad call at all for a top tier driver. And I made a -10 last week to get a team in position for something like that this week. So we're pretty much bang on even if we're looking at trades the last couple of weeks. I'm not even sure if I need to show my team now, given
you basically it's this image, with right? Piastri.
Yeah, pretty much. Here we go. This is mine. So yeah, as I said, like Sargent is the enabler for the team, but it's a line ball decision on Sainz and Piastri. So similar lineups, can't complain.
Good. Awesome. Let's go back into our lineup review. See if we can knock out a lot of these too.
I'm going to try and, if I can, kill 2 birds with 1 stone and answer questions in the chat as we're looking at teams too. So anyway, I don't see, this is from Carlos RSD. I don't have any prompts, but of the 2 lineups, do you have a strong preference?
In the week that we have here, I'd go with the team on the right. Let's spread that love out between Leclerc and Alonso. Hope we can have a couple of dart throws in the top 5, get you some cost cap boost too. You still have plenty of Red Bull coverage, and this is an easy team to get back to the team on the left come Canada.
Yep, very much like it. I think Leclerc has the highest budget upside of everyone. So, okay, next. That's pretty close to what I think Terry's running, if I'm not mistaken. Verstappen, yes. McLaren, Ferrari, 2 good qualifiers in the Sauber duo. But
looks good to me.
Yeah, I like it. I really like it. And then final fix. I just wait until you decide on what driver actually could replace that, because Ocon could have a stinker and it doesn't really then make sense to have him in your team.
Yeah, you just have to wait and see what is the price range of the driver that has the stinker. What if Max gets into traffic and he's out in Q2? Then all of a sudden you're putting in Charles. So just wait and see.
Yeah. Oh, okay. It's a bit busy. I've got that exact team on the left.
I say the left team is the Rob.
Where's the team? That's the Adam.
The right team is the team on the right is the only 2 transfers is the F1 Fantasy Tools. I'm the team on the right, so you know which one I like the most.
Yeah, I think they're all great, to be honest.
I would probably rule out the second team, that if you're taking 3 transfers, if it's a -10 for you, I don't like that one so much that I would take a -10 compared to those other options.
Yeah, that's fair. I think we're aligned. Teams on the left and the right. I think I'd rather stick or just do Max to Leclerc and roll. I mean, you could just go for, I know you're probably leaving a bit of money on the table, but having Leclerc over Max, even if you have that kind of 6 extra million, I don't think it's a bad thing at all. And if in the off chance one of those drivers, like let's just call it Ricardo or Stroll, somehow qualifies in the top 5, you can just final fix that driver in for one of your back markers. So no point, or maybe just avoid taking hits if you can, unless you're obviously doing something like you.
Agreed.
I think this is the only 2 here. Again, I really like the right-hand side for cost cap and for Ferrari upside. So
same, and it gives you more flexibility. If these guys, those midfield drivers, have any issues and it's time for the final fix, you've got 3 of the, or maybe even 4 of the 5 cheapest drivers in the game. So it's final fix out Max or nothing. The one on the right gives you that, if Esteban Ocon has a good qualifying, or Daniel Ricciardo, you have that flexibility there.
That's right. Oh, okay. I think if you're going -20, I can answer this without even asking for your opinion, because I think you're going to say the same thing. -20, either wild card or maybe just don't think about it at all. I still like the middle team without the hits, to be honest. I think
Same.
Yeah. I think it's it looks good to me. I'd just activate wildcard if you really feel strongly about triple Ferrari at that point.
Agreed.
And then again, pretty identical, except Sargent instead of your team, Sargent over Hulkenberg. But I think Hulkenberg's the better of the two. So
I wish I could afford this. It's partly
Yeah,
why
same.
I'm running a team like this, is that I want to be able to afford slightly better midfield drivers.
Yeah. And then I think that brings us to the end. So last team, I think the -10 is Magnussen in for Bottas, which I'm just not sure I can.
It only makes sense if you hear from Sauber in the next 5 minutes that he's screwed.
Yeah, which can't really help me. I've already locked in my team. Cool. Well, we aced that pretty well. There's quite a few extra questions in the chat I'd like to cover off, and then we can do our prize, our giveaway.
Let's do it.
Yeah. I'm going to throw up in the meantime the sims. So if anyone wants an opinion on one driver or another, they can just look at the sims
It'll
and
be
decide
up
for
there,
themselves, because I think we've covered a fair bit that's been asked, and I don't want to keep kind of repeating what we've already said. What mark were we at in the chat?
I'm somewhere around 9:42 now. Somewhere in the last 10-ish minutes.
Okay.
Kalula 311, would you use no negative? I probably wouldn't this week. And even if that means we have a driver that DNFs, I think it's better to save it for a sprint.
Yep. I like that too. Wouldn't take a -10 for Hulkenberg. I love racing as Epic's team. But it's Ferrari, Leclerc, Alonso, McLaren, Ferrari, or Leclerc, Red Bull. I think the Leclerc, Alonso, McLaren, Ferrari for me.
Yep, me too.
Yeah. Alonso, Tsunoda, or Piastri, Bottas. I'm going to say Piastri, Bottas, because I think it's tough. It's tough, but I just like Piastri more for cost cap and for points upside.
Flip a coin for me.
Yeah,
they're that close.
So they're tight. Yeah. Jeremy's asking -10 to swap Bottas for Gasly. I'm not sure it's worth it, to be honest. I don't think either driver will score 10 points this weekend.
Yeah, I feel like Gasly's going to find himself at like P12, P13, and then not really move anywhere and get the same 0 as Bottas.
Yeah. I think we've said Sainz and Piastri is pretty.
I've officially thrown Christopher for a loop. Yes, this is my first -10 for the year. Yeah. I hate taking -10, but I'm doing it. I really want to see some cost cap gains from my team, because I was very jealous of Rob and the others after last week.
I don't know. I don't think my budget went up quite as much. It might have gone up maybe like 0.4, 0.5 compared to yours, but you also had 10, 15 extra points on me. So it's kind of like one or the other, right? In a budget pickle, would you suggest Albon or Zhou?
Albon, because I think of these drivers that can sneak their way into the top 10, he can. He hasn't lately, but he can.
Okay. Well, we're definitely losing my mark, and the deadline's in 7 minutes, so lock in those teams if you haven't already. Wouldn't take -10s for the most part. Autopilot, I think maybe, but I also think there's probably a case to make it. I think Leclerc just looks too good. So if you've got Leclerc on your team, there's really very little argument I could suggest. But
Rob, there's some questions in the chat. Could you just pan down? You got the drivers up. Can you pan down to the constructors now?
Got it. Yep.
And you can see
wow,
Ferrari, Red Bull right up there, and then a bit of a dip to McLaren. That's, I think, assuming some things out of Checo.
Yeah, it is. The pit stops are probably also a big point to Red Bull's upside there, but it's also not what just one constructor alone, but kind of what you can do with the rest of that budget, that extra 4 million or so, how you can spread that around. So,
ooh, Rob, here's a new question. Anxious wants to know, what about autopilot? If you've got that Leclerc Piastri build or a triple Ferrari build, what about autopilot?
I think if you've got Leclerc, it's like you'd have to really think the curse is going to strike him bad if you wanted to go autopilot. I just think he's the standout best option this week as the 2X. So I think if you've got Leclerc, I wouldn't stress. But if you've got like a Sainz Piastri or a Hamilton Piastri, then go for it if you think it's the right time for it.
I'm hopeful with autopilot that we can build our cost caps in the second half of the year to the point where you're reliably running 2 really top drivers and you'll have a better autopilot hedge.
Yep. Yeah.
Rob, we're down to our last few minutes here. Do you want to pick a contest winner?
You got it. Yeah. Let me just quickly find the contest names. Okay. Hang on. Copy those into wheel and names. Put them there. All right. Let's give it a whirl.
Mastivos. I think this is the first 2-time winner we've ever had.
That's great. Great result. We'll be in touch. FanAmp will be in touch to sort out your gift card. So congratulations.
They're going to be very well dressed. I've got my Senna shirt on over here.
I got my Leclerc. Hopefully, where is it? Hopefully, a bit of an omen. His new helmet for this season.
I love my 5th gear garb.
And then Charles Leclerc's car at Monaco over my shoulder. So living Ferrari this weekend. Cool. Well, congratulations. I think we'll hopefully cover off the last few questions in the chat, unless, of course, there's any other closing remarks.
No, I think we just keep a very close eye on qualifying. Keep an eye on our socials tonight. If there are final fix candidates, Rob and I will definitely give you an earful on all of them. So really just go with the best lineup for this unique circuit. Give yourself some room to get out of it come Canada, because I think the max Red Bull builds will start to come thundering back next week.
Fully agree. Okay. Let's just knock out the last few questions. I think we've covered quite a few of them already. So
Realsy wants to know, should I go Red Bull to McLaren when I can't make use of the extra 4 million? So I think that means maybe you're out of transfers or you can't quite reach the next tier of drivers. It would depend on what the rest of your lineup looks like, but I'd probably say keep Red Bull at that point. 4 million, and I think you'd be really close.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And then, is Sargent worth it to have Piastri? I mean, I think it is. I wanted to enable 2 big top hitting drivers, so I think it is. There is risk, but I'm happy to take that punt, and I think you are too.
I've seen Kevin in a few places, so let's hit his question. I have to take a -20 or wild card to get Leclerc plus Piastri or Sainz with McLaren and Ferrari. But I can do no minus points if I skip the Sainz and Piastri bit and go for Tsunoda. So Leclerc and Tsunoda versus Leclerc plus Sainz or Piastri, and then a big penalty or a wild card. I would say my gut right now is Leclerc, Tsunoda, final fix in Piastri or Sainz if you're in trouble. Like if Leclerc has the unthinkable happen in qualifying where he wrecks his car again.
Yeah, that's true. Cool. I like that.
Luis just woke up. Sainz or Piastri. Depends who you ask. We're split.
Yeah, we are split. It's a coin flip. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Everyone lock your teams in. I think that might do it for today. Super busy stream as well. So
yes, thank you all. This is probably my favorite stream of the year so far. So thank you all for coming and for being so engaging. We'll be right back at it in 2 weeks for Canada. So we hope to see you all there.
Thanks all.